Hello, I'm John Atack, as you well know by now, and this is the wonderful, the incredible, the amazing. Well, it's my good friend and colleague Joe Szimhart. At least none of us are quite wonderful enough around here. And
yes. Anyway, I still have a missing tooth here. I'm still waiting months for this implant. It's a crazy, but anyway.
So, okay, well.
Anyway, with that, let's get going here. I'm imperfect as usual.
As are we all. Only Allah is perfect, so I'm told. You've been making some great little 15-minute videos about all sorts of things on your channel, and I watched the 2 videos you did about Eckhart Tolle, and that's led us into this conversation about these kind of gurus, New Age leaders who aren't as rapacious as Ron Hubbard or Elizabeth Clare Prophet or Rajneesh or Sun Myung Moon and on and on and on. They haven't built these great followings, but they have had a tremendous influence, and they have made a lot of money, which is the spiritual glue that sticks society together. Some may think
it's called economy.
Economy, yeah. Looking after your family, isn't it, or something like that? It means. Words change. So there are a lot of these people about. Deepak Chopra is another who bubbles up in this. And with Eckhart Tolle, there's a sense that he's probably quite genuine. He probably does believe the not tremendously intelligent material that he promotes. And we get things like, the Course in Miracles or The Secret, things that made a great deal of money and really haven't helped in the progress of humanity, as far as I can tell. So, give us some reflection.
Yeah, I think they basically, picking on Tolle, as I did in 2 videos, is not very difficult, because he's kind of a soft spiritual leader. He's not radical in too many ways, other than the fact that he has a basic assumption about his awareness of this now, that he calls it, or the I am presence is the I am called it, and you can go on and on with this.
Be here
as
now.
I said,
yeah.
Be here now, yeah, exactly, with
Baba
Ramdas,
Richard
Alpert. but yeah, and we can fold a lot of other spiritual leaders and pundits. Jordan Peterson's another one. He leans right wing, but he's kind of like a guru to many people. He has a cult following of sorts.
And he's also recently declared his belief in God and this sort of thing. So
why not?
Yeah, bring it on in.
Yeah, let's hijack God and put him into our podcast. He's always good for getting attention. I didn't mention this on my videos, but I look back in the New Age movement when all the channeling was going on, and I did mention that Eckhart seems to be channeling his inner self when he pauses and thinks and looks, into the distance of the cosmos and comes up with a pithy answer to something, and quotes Jung or quotes Krishnamurti or quotes whatever, in order to make his point. But I was thinking back to this channeled group of entities called Lazarus. And back in the day of Ramtha, when Ramtha was making a big splash in the 80s, late 80s, and Elizabeth Clare Prophet was at her height, and there was so much channeling going on. I recall one show did a survey in Los Angeles alone. There were over 1,500 people channeling entities in Los Angeles, so that's quite a few people. Big competition in the field. Well, anyway, Jach Purcell, Jach Purcell, channeled this being called Lazarus. He was a businessman and got into kind of New Age thinking and crystal power. And his wife noticed one day that he went into this trance and he began, channeling this entity. And anyway, his spouse and someone else became his handler and put him on the market. He got promoted by Anne-Marie Benstrom, who also promoted Ramtha at the Hollywood Ashram Spa. And Jach Purcell became a celebrity, kind of a quiet one, and not too many people paid attention to him, but he made far more money than all the other channelers going at the time. You know, he was, and he was kind of a easygoing guy. Now, he himself was kind of like an Eckhart Tolle in the fact that I think he genuinely believed this stuff. His handlers were making most of the money, and he was not managing the corporation, so to speak. Like Jay-Z Knight, for instance, managed the corporation. So did L. Ron Hubbard, you know, managed quite a bit of it. They were money hungry. Purcell, maybe Tolle isn't so much money hungry as wanting to help people hungry. You know, they see humanity as a therapeutic project. And that's typical of gurus. They see you, your follower, as a therapeutic project. Come to me, I'm going to help you manage your life. If you follow my directions, you will become, you know, more karma free, you will become more prone to salvation, you will become more enlightened, you know, all of that good stuff. And so I think that that's what Purcell thought he was doing by channeling this group being Lazarus. And his thing was to pass out crystals at all of the events in the early days. They had a big compound down in Florida, the leaders of the whole thing. And he did what Tolle does. You know, he had these big, massive workshops that a lot of people came to and paid quite a bit of money for, sold a lot of books. So I think we're talking about people that are kind of under the hard cult radar, and maybe what we might call a little bit culty. but the point that I'm making is that it's nevertheless a territory that has a lot of manipulation in it because of fear and anxiety about life and offering solutions for that fear and anxiety, and also insight into the ultimate realm of being, which is always delicious. You know, we all want to go to that table and eat of that meal where we can experience the ultimate essence of being, you know, and do our Dasein thing and come up with a solution, you know, be in the now, be mindful. I mean, that's very attractive to many people. It's a way of escape from our humdrum, painful, otherwise anxious, depressed lives. And, you know, and I go back to early Gnosticism, which was an escape from this painful world. In a sense, Buddha offered something similar, except he was much more practical than the early Gnostics. The Gnostics developed these communes in many places, separated from society. They were radical dualists. They didn't think there was a calling to help other people. In other words, they didn't have compassion on all sentient beings, which was an essential component of the Buddha's way. So anyway, just to finish this up, my main criticism of Tolle was that he lacks this visceral, life-engaging philosophy. And I used my metaphor, well, it was a real event, but of a dog attack on my dog and how I had to separate that. And, you know, when that happens, you really are in the now, whatever you want to call that. And the now isn't necessarily always pleasant. You know, it's not this mystical bliss that Joseph Campbell promoted. And Campbell's another one in this realm of the popular, little bit culty guru thing, you know, that we're talking about. So. Yeah.
I'd agree. And I mean, what you say about being in the present moment, I 10 years ago had a home invasion. 3 guys with machetes came into my house. And I don't think I've ever been more in the now than I was at that time. Bang!
That's right.
Nothing else was going on in my head other than self-preservation. And I've, you know, read people who are doing their mindfulness meditation and bragging about being in the now, and you're sort of saying, well, actually, to function properly, it's a very good idea to have memory. It's a very good idea to analyze things according to your past experience, and that's something we do fairly naturally. And I think we see people that they want a bliss state, and the bliss state is often an avoidance reality. It's a way of not having to deal with reality. So I've interviewed transcendental meditators who had got up to the point where they were spending 12 hours a day meditating, and their kids were running wild and they weren't doing their jobs because they'd become sort of junkies for this state of being.
But but they're blissful. And we used to call it, when leaving Church Universal and Triumphant, you could see people decreeing a lot more than the average. And, they had that smile on their face and that kind of 10,000 mile stare, and when you knock, there's nobody home sometimes. In other words, there's an avoidance of the pain of life and engaging, and they have a means to do it, whether it's a mantra or a decree or a state of mind, or constantly going back to this now inner state, or whatever, self-remembering, as Gurdjieff called it. A lot of Gurdjieff followers that were in his inner circle would walk around during the day looking like they were dazed because they were self-remembering, but it's a form of derealization, and sometimes dissociation, even in some of the worst cases, in people that are highly spiritually motivated in these cults.
I read about 10 years ago, I read quite a lot of Sufi literature. I also read a dozen of Joseph Campbell's books. And in the Sufi literature, you come across these people who've gone into a bliss state and then emerge decades later. So they're basically functioning catatonics. They don't contribute anything. They have to be looked after, and they're I don't know if you come across this term, but in the German counter-cult scene about 20, 30 years ago, I heard this lovely term, ausgeblist. Blissed out. And if that is the objective of your life, then okay, make sure you've got somebody who'll pay for your food and look after you.
Well, in India, this is common, to have a guru go into that state, and they're considered a living god, and they get taken care of, they get bathed, they get fed, they get carried around, and they're constantly dissociated. They're in this bliss, whatever you want to call it. But hell, I mean, to me, that's no big deal. I mean, we get into that when we sleep to some degree, and when we die. Okay, so everybody experiences it. Everybody's going to experience it, and to force it through yoga, to force it through continual attention to this concentration on the breath merely, for instance, and at the expense of experiencing the sensual world in its fullness. You have to question what is the value of that? What does that mean? Is that enlightenment? And does it's very selfish and narcissistic in a sense, because you're totally autistic at that point, cut off in a, like you said, a catatonic state. And I've seen mental patients that come in that are catatonic, and they're in that state, and they're not unhappy. They're just blissed out. So I have to question whether it's self-induced mental illness or something else, because obviously from an outer perspective, which is all we really know, we have to essentially experience how other people behave and talk and run their lives over time in order to make an assessment. You might as well be worshiping a statue if you're going to worship a catatonic guru.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at in India, the gurus, you have the bed of nails is the famous one that's been known about a long time in Western culture. But you'll have somebody who, for example, put their arm out and keep that position until it becomes non-functional.
No, I've seen that in India. When I traveled there for a month, I went to a Shiva festival, and truckloads of beggars would come in, and some of them are these sadhus that are in very distorted body, like their arm is straight up and it's just stuck there, and they can't walk, and other ones have limbs missing, but they're paraded, they're set along the path where all the people are moving, and they collect money, and a lot of that money goes back to their handlers, the people that drive the trucks that bring them there. I mean, it's almost, at least it was back then, 40 years ago, a kind of an industry to parade these eccentric, sideshow people out on the path of a great parade. Unfortunately, it seems like they were getting taken advantage of. Some of them probably were in this catatonic, blissful, in quotes, state. It didn't look good, and And I didn't give out money knowing that a lot of the money went to their handlers. It wasn't really helping them at all, except, for basic needs.
I mean, I'm fascinated by just the nature of belief. I keep repeating this decade after decade. Voltaire, people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing just how much we are driven by our beliefs. And in a moment, just on a little bit of a sidebar, I've been reading books by Tim Spector. He's a professor of genetic epidemiology. He designed the largest medical survey that's ever been done, nearly 5 million people through COVID. He's published 900 papers. And he basically has been writing to say what you're being told by your doctors about nutrition is not based upon evidence. And this is quite serious, that because we have this authority structure, we believe people because they've gone and qualified, they have special knowledge that we don't have, and they'll tell us, well, this is what you should do. And he is digging into the research. He's done decades of research with identical twins and fraternal twins. And, a piece of good news, perhaps, is that in that study, he's shown that if one of the identical twins has the most fantastic health food diet in the world, they're vegan, they're whatever, and the other eats at McDonald's, they will probably be about the same shape and size because there's a genetic determinant.
Yeah. But
he then goes, well, what can you do about that? Well, functionally, you have a microbiome in your gut, and he's not giving any kind of this is the way, the truth, and the life. He's saying, well, actually, this is what we found out, that you can change how you feel and your health by adapting your microbiome. He's only got so far as to say you need to eat a huge diversity of particularly fruits and vegetables so the enzymes will stimulate the right bacterial response. It's a good idea to keep away from refined sugar, to keep the amount of that down. But he then has a variety of things that he's saying, and he provides the evidence. He provides, references to the papers. So, for example, it would appear that chocolate is very good for us, which I've long believed. The sugar that is mixed with it is not very good for us.
Yeah.
So you need to go above 70% cocoa for the beneficial effects. Coffee, many awful things have been written about coffee, and he's saying, well, actually, none of these appear to be true. He also is very insistent that it's a matter of you as an individual, that there are no blanket sets of rules, save that things like arsenic will probably kill anybody, even Rasputin, in a high enough quantity. But he then takes on things like the low-fat diet and rips apart the evidence from the 50s and 60s. He talks about cholesterol and the things we're being told about that. And he then gets into the studies on salt and says, actually, this 6 grams a day of salt and people being desperate to keep their salt down because of high blood pressure. While it is true, if you put salt into blood, that pressure will rise. But in fact, it would appear that we're able to metabolize salt far better than has been estimated before. What's important about this is, those conclusions are very important, and we should all have a look at that. What's important is the nature of authority and the nature of belief, so that we are told that this is where we ought to go. I was a practitioner of Soto Zen as a teenager, and I really got the idea, we're going for enlightenment. This is the thing we should be doing. Now I'm a somewhat older human being, and it seems enlightenment seems to me, yes, narcissistic. The idea of becoming a superior being who's serene at all costs. And in real life, if we look at Soto Zen, I've often on this channel recommended Zen at War by Brian Daizen Victoria, who is a Zen priest. And he has been instrumental in bringing particularly the Rinzai sects of Zen to apologize for their part in training the imperial army and the murder and mayhem committed. So the Nanjing massacre, 150,000 civilians killed in China. The general who ordered that received a letter of commendation from his Zen master, saying that he had helped to bring true Buddhism to China by massacring 150,000 civilians. So people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. And while, Eckhart Tolle and so many others in this field may be very genuine, Deepak Chopra may even be genuine. I'm not too sure.
Okay, but genuine is a term that has to be explained in context. So I use this with Jach Purcell. They may be genuine within their self-honesty about what they know and what they think they're doing, but genuine as far as being socially viable, that takes another test. It's not just personal experience, because personal experience, of course, is only the first step toward grasping reality. It's not the last, which is completely flipped in the New Age movement and other things where, it's my personal experience that my guru was a good person. Boom, end of sentence, full stop. And you have to start scratching your head, don't you think it's a problem that your guru was having sex with underage girls or manipulating the money? And they don't want to hear that because their personal experience invalidates all of that. And this is, of course, the definition of a cult member.
I had a very direct experience of that. I met a man who spent 17 years in prison after the Waco siege, Livingston Fagan. And I was very impressed by him. He didn't strike me as a fool. But 17 years in prison, and he still believed. And we were on a BBC TV show called The Big Questions. And I put it to him that there must be something wrong with David Koresh, because wasn't it true that he'd had sex with a 12-year-old girl? And Livingston Fagan just didn't respond. Right. That we don't care about that. And the idea that, of course, he'd been having sex with the wives of all of the members, this sort of thing, a different value system comes in, because there's this belief.
Right, and let alone that Koresh butchered the gospel. He basically tore it into pieces and then put it together the way he wanted it to sound. And that doesn't make any sense to someone like that either. No,
absolutely. And so Martin Gardner said that you can be a crank and a charlatan, which I long thought was a really wonderful observation, that because looking at Ron Hubbard, I'm pretty sure that on Wednesdays and Fridays, he believed everything he said. But then, we know from many witness accounts that he had terrible doubts about what he was doing as well. And I think that this becomes very complicated, this sense that an individual, they believe they've had some sort of transcendent experience. And that might well be what you or I would call depersonalization, the sense that they're outside their body in some way, or derealization, where the world around is melting. They believe they've achieved something superior state, where the reality may very well be that what they've achieved is a psychiatric state. And their certainty, their belief in their knowledge crumbles, and they then have to somehow project outwards and pretend that they still feel this way. But when we look at what they've achieved, you brought up the early Gnostics, so fascinating study, all of these groups who, again, to some extent penetrated the Sufi movement. Later on, you have something very similar. You have the Manichaean movement that survives. But there's this idea of the electoi, the elect, the one group of people have been chosen, and they know the passwords that after death will.
The Greek was the pneumatics.
The spirit or air within things. And this idea of superiority I find very worrying. The idea that some people have become perfected, they believe they've become perfected and should be served by others. And these movements fade away. I mean, in the early centuries, once Christianity had gained purchase on Constantine in the early 4th century, these people are hunted down, and the philosophers, as they're called, are butchered as part of the loving gospel of Jesus, which has been adopted by the Roman Empire, which is never a very loving organization. But what fascinates me is this sense of incompleteness that people have. This, as you say, the fear, the anxiety about death, the attempt to understand the meaning of the world. And along comes some person who's had an experience, and they may be genuine, they may be perfectly authentic in what they're saying. And as you said, Eckhart Tolle seems to believe what he's saying.
Well, I think he had a personal experience. He like I said, he somehow emerged for whatever reason, went into remission about his melancholia, whatever depression, anxiety he was suffering from, and he became kind of a blissful person sitting on a bench talking to people. And I've seen this with mental patients. Some of them emerge, and even with addicts, that I've worked with, they have this overwhelming change. Kind of like the AA experience of Alcoholics Anonymous, of God or some sort of divinity, an overwhelming sense that they've touched an inner self, and then they begin the process of making amends, and it's easier for them to not take the next drink, and so forth, because they've reached a deeper sense of a healthy self. Do we call that enlightenment, or do we call that healing? And if you go back to Jesus, there was no difference between saving someone and healing someone. The idea that you're healed of all your sins is almost like being healed of leprosy. Back in that old Jewish tradition, sin and illness were linked. And even in our New Thought tradition now, the New Thought cult that Tully's part of, I think, in some way, they also link that if you're unhealthy, you're not just unlucky, you are not Christ-like.
Yeah.
You're not taking on the mind of God or the mind of Christ or the mind of the essence of the universe or whatever form of new thought you happen to fall into. But so it's a way of simplifying the breadth and scope of existence, and then to try to sit there on the mountaintop of bliss, while thinking that you've achieved something, but that's a lonely spot to be in. So you have to invite people to come up there to talk, listen to you on stage or whatever, and talk about the mountaintop experience. Human beings weren't meant to live on mountaintops.
No, unless of course you're Tibetan, and they apparently have genes that
or extremely wealthy, where you can teleport some kind of a house up there and make it environmentally safe for you to live in, but otherwise
pumping oxygen.
Yes, we need to live more closer to the valleys and deal with the lions and tigers.
Yes. And when you see any of these gurus, that what's happened, as you say, is that they've had an experience of melancholia, they've had an experience of distress, depression, anxiety. They've then had what they believe to be a transcendent experience. And then they tell people about it. And they've transformed from being alone and isolated into now having an audience and being considered important. And they're being adulated by a group of people. And so what is the measure of this state, that what they're selling is becoming like them, which is to say...
I brought it up in my video, the idea of an overvalued idea. We often, when cults are operating, it's not so much that the people are in some kind of a psychotic control by the leader. That only happens momentarily in some situations, like when Manson got people to go kill people.
Yes.
That's when it entered into real criminal psychosis, in a sense, about what he was doing. But most of the time, they're just basically overvaluing him. He's doing his thing during the day. He's being charming. He's playing his guitar. He's sleeping. He's having sex with the young women or whatever. And the other people are going about their day. They're working on the crops in the field. They're tending to the horses. They're whatever. So, but the overall sense is that this whole experience is being overvalued. And that's where people can get into trouble, because when you overvalue an idea, then you become the favorite, and you also will begin to attack anything that attacks it. and without reason sometimes. So, and I think that's what happens with people like Tolle and Jordan Peterson. They quickly become overvalued because they seem so sensitive, or they seem so smart, or they seem so invested in getting things right, and they become kind of a one-off speaker that makes a lot of sense to somebody, or offers relief to other people, by practicing their little technique, whatever it is that they're doing. If you put this crystal in the middle of your living room, your house will be much more harmonious. And of course, people self-suggest and they feel the harmony, if they maintain the overvaluing of this connection with this rock in the house, so.
Well, don't knock it. The pet rock movement is a true religion.
Yes, it was.
Still exists.
I have rocks around my house. I could show you. I just kept them from where I found them on the beach, and whatever. They have some sort of value. Again, when does it become overvalued? What is that? And that's a kind of a mental illness. It's not the hardcore mental illness, like a manic situation or someone that's had a break with reality and schizophrenia. But nevertheless, it has something to do with characterological disorder, where you feel your narcissistic self knows that how real this is without any other testing, or very little testing going on. Just like, you read the book, The Power of Now, or you hear Eckhart Tolle lecture, and he strikes you within as someone that's making a lot of sense, and you feel better after reading his book. So you've taken an aspirin and your headache has gone away, but does that mean you have to take 10 aspirin? Right. And so this is where the problem comes in. Yeah.
And this last year or so, I keep harking back to the idea of the internal enemy that is sold by, so many people in psychotherapy and in religion. The idea that you have a demon within you. Or an unconscious mind, which is not, of course we have unconscious processes. There are processes going on below consciousness, but there's not some little guy in there called id or superego who's secretly telling you what to do. And often what gurus will do is sell this idea that you have the enemy within, and I can help you to release that. And ultimately they don't. One of my reflections when I left Scientology 39 years ago was that, it could be viewed that Hubbard had seen the scripture saying how difficult it is to get a camel through the eye of a needle, whether we mean a literal eye of the needle or the gate in Jerusalem called the eye of the needle. It's easier for that than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Hubbard was very kindly making sure that nobody was rich. He was taking away the worship of mammon from people. And of course, in Scientology, you have a governing policy, which I must say I didn't see until after I'd left, which reads: make money, make more money, make others produce so as to make even more money. That's the governing policy of a religion. Make as much money as you possibly can. And it's a terrible place. We as human beings, we need a sense of community. We need a sense of purpose. And so when we look at, an Amish community or a group of Krishna devotees, there's this bonding, this attachment to the group that is fulfilling to people. And then there's the desperate sense found in so many groups, particularly in Scientology, that without us, the world is going to disappear into hell, that it's going to be impossible for humanity to survive. With Hubbard, it was, I want Scientologists to survive World War III. And so far they have. There's this, so you're getting away from fear and anxiety by joining the group, and then the group is giving you fear and anxiety. And you're being driven by that and driven by a purpose from the outside.
Well, especially, the fear of anxiety of what happens without the group. If you leave the group, that's the fear that keeps you in. If you don't keep reading and studying A Course in Miracles, you may not get the meaning of it, and you may not be able to overcome this direness of end times coming, because the revelation of Jesus through the Course is allowing you to become your own salvation. Basically, that's what the Course is teaching. And of course, every day when you shut the book, you realize when you walk down the street, you're not really your own salvation, because all this normal stuff is getting in your way. You have to deal with your neighbor. You have to go to work. You're getting sick from whatever. You have to go see the doctor. And then you come back and open up A Course in Miracles, and you read these pithy things about, that these ideas and thoughts that are coming are an attack on this eternal instant, the holy instant that you're supposed to be in all the time. And if you're not in it, well, then there's something wrong, and you have to go back and read the Course and apply the material. And so the book becomes an overvalued object that you keep opening all the time and going through these workshop things daily and all of this, when in fact the whole book is just some sort of a dump out of Helen Schuckman's head over 7 years as she was channeling this voice. So the limitations of the book are the limitations of a woman who was quite anxious and quite invested in the occulture in different ways through her experience of Christianity and theosophy and whatever she was into, through her family when she was younger. But and she was influenced into New Thought by her compatriot that helped her write the Course at Columbia Hospital. But Bill Thetford, he was a New Thought type person. So you can understand why the Course, after 7 years, took on this New Thought ideation. And anyway, all I'm pointing out here is that we can overvalue these things. We get some value out of reading it, some inspiration, and then suddenly, like Oprah did on her show with A Course in Miracles back in the late 80s, she lifted it up and said, "This is my Bible." Now you've gotten into a case of overvaluing the whole thing, and it turns into a cult object at the exclusion of maybe better forms of philosophy and better forms of Christianity that you could be entertaining.
And the essential point that you make, that disease, misfortune, these are things that you generate. It's your fault. It's your karma, or vipaka, if we prefer the reaction. And you are to blame. You are guilty. When you start putting forward the idea of virus, of bacteria, of fungus, that these things are here, and the idea now becomes that you will be resistant to these things because you're being good. A friend of mine was with his girlfriend, this many years ago. He was being driven by his girlfriend, and he was getting a little alarmed about the cavalier way in which she was driving. She was driving too fast. She was not really looking out, and he complained. And in typical Scientology form, she said, "Well, are you PTS? Are you a potential trouble source? Are you an attractor to something bad? Because if you're not, then we'll be fine. I can close my eyes and we will drive down the street and everything will be good." So we start getting this ridiculous imbalance where there's the thought that everything, the just world concept, some people call it, that everything that happens to you is your fault. It's because you pulled it in Scientology terms, which when you look at that from the other side, at the complexity that would be necessary for karma to function, when a giant clam has 2 billion little clamlets, most of which will be eaten, of course, nearly all of which will be eaten, but each one of them has a soul. Each one of them has an entry in the book of karma, the Akashic records. And you look at the complexity of the system. It's like Laplace's demon in science, the idea that you could know everything that was going to happen in the universe if for one instant you knew where everything was. And the problem is, Laplace's demon, it would take a computer larger than the universe to actually calculate that. Their computers are getting a lot faster. But with karma, for 419 people to get on an airplane that crashes, and how it was that those 419 were attracted to go on that flight and meet their end, this becomes imponderable. It becomes difficult. But it's a beautifully simple thought, that what goes around comes around. And it's a way of not feeling compassion for others. When Arthur Koestler, desperate because his friend Aldous Huxley and various other people he knew were becoming involved in yoga and Zen in the 50s, he wrote a book called The Lotus and the Robot. He visited India, he visited Japan, and he looked at how the religious systems worked there, what yoga was doing there. And one of the things he pointed out about India was, I don't know if this is accurate, but something like 98% of the charitable work being done in India was being done by Christian organizations.
Yeah.
And he thought, well, that's because of karma. That's because there's no concern for others. And what an inversion of compassion that becomes, rather than saying, how can I ameliorate and make the world a better place? Sitting in a position of judgment on the rest of humanity and saying, well, they pulled it in. It's because they deserved to suffer that they're suffering.
Well, that idea of karma, was infected the West through the Theosophical Society and all these New Age groups that picked it up. I had a discussion with an elderly, very wealthy woman that was into the Ramtha teachings in Santa Fe, and she was of that conviction that you don't interfere with other people's karma because they have to work it out. In other words, don't throw murderers in jail. Yeah,
and if you see a child running out into the road in front of an oncoming vehicle, let them do it, because don't.
And that's where I caught her. I used an example because we're standing in the street in Santa Fe, and I said, well, if there was a woman here with a 2-year-old child, and the 2-year-old child got away and was running past you, and it looks like they were going to run into traffic, which was right next to us. I said, would you try to stop that child? She had to think about that. And then she finally said, well, of course I would, but the point that I'm saying is that she had to think about that you couldn't instinctually know that you have to help a runaway child in traffic. That's how bizarre this idea that somehow fate arranges our lives, the gods, the fates, and we shouldn't interfere with them, because if we do, we just have to come back again. And in other words, the 2-year-old kid would have to come back and get hit by a car in another life because they haven't fulfilled that particular karma, because they probably ran over somebody with a carriage horse and killed them, back in Roman times or whatever. And and this is something that they have to do. And this bizarre, convoluted explanation makes sense. It has a rational basis to it, and it's not in reality, in terms of how we value life, in the present, but it is rationalized and it makes sense to someone that has that kind of cult belief.
Yeah, that and it's something that we see in the nutrition world again, where the story makes sense. So, if you are getting too fat, then eat a low-fat diet.
But it's even worse than that. It makes sense to me. Back to the narcissistic or autistic self. It's making sense to me. Therefore, my personal experience dictates my reality. I have the right as an individual, as a free soul under God, to make this choice, to take this product that I bought from some multi-level marketer over my doctor's advice because it makes sense to me. And people react this way continually, and obviously I understand why. Reality can be confusing, medicine and healing can be confusing. There aren't always easy cures for things, and people want to at least try something, whether it's going to church more often, or listening to their astrologer, as to what is this all about, and figuring something out. We look for magical solutions when other solutions don't seem to be working very well.
Yes, and we look to what feels right to us, which gives us a feeling, a sense of certainty, which is based upon how we feel, not upon evidence. And it can be very difficult, particularly, as I say, with the case where you have, at one of the conventions, I was reading a book called Collective Illusions, and I got about 20 pages in or something, And the guy says, as we all know, we have to drink 8 glasses of water a day.
Right.
I'm going, you're telling me about collective illusions. That particular one I have tracked down several times, and there is no medical evidence supporting it. It doesn't come from a medical survey. It appears that in the 1950s, somebody estimated that you would need this quantity of water in your diet, but that would include the reality that a potato is 80% water, and that it would be, wherever the water came from. But even there, it was a tiny little study. And you will, in this country, if you go to a pharmacy, a drugstore, that they will tell you need to drink this much water. My mum, who lived, bless her, lived to be 94, would every day when I got up, because I have a delayed sleep phase, I'd get up at midday and she'd tell me how many times she'd been to take a pee that morning. And she was insistent that she had to drink this many glasses of water. And at the same time, she was being given diuretic tablets to get water out of her system. And there was no way, she was a smart woman, but there was no way of convincing her that this was not the scientific reality, and that, she'd be better off relying upon the internal mechanism called thirst, which,
yes,
it's got to this point where you've got kids who have to have their water bottles, and they've got to have electrolytes as well, which elsewhere we're being told that the electrolytes or salts are bad for us, particularly sodium chloride. But when it's added to our sports drink, along with a load of glucose, it's meant to be good for us. So there's a difficulty that it's a matter of choosing your authorities in life. Joseph Campbell's a very interesting example of this. As I say, I read about a dozen of his books, and I found what he had to say extraordinarily interesting, where he's tying together the Hero with 1,000 Faces in the 40s, his breakthrough book, where he's saying he's trying to pursue Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. And because the same stories appear all over the world, you have a starving parent, and some supernatural being will come and fight with you for 3 days, and you bury their head, and corn will come up, or manioc, or rice, or wherever you are in the world, this story happens, and there are 3 days involved in the burying of a head. And he was, maybe this is drawn down from the collective unconscious. And he determined that it wasn't, that there was the stories themselves had traveled largely out of Sumeria. He doesn't seem to have been aware of Cambodia and the influence that probably had, particularly on the Chinese culture. But nonetheless, these stories migrated and were then told. And I think where he's talking about that, he's very useful. But if you choose him as an authority on how to live life, you get into a certain amount of difficulty, because he put forward this notion of chivalry that talked about the courts of love and the Arthurian legends, and how that the love of our spouse, the love of our partner, should replace the religious love. And he didn't have any children. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very significant point, as he'd created this little bubble with his young, beautiful wife, dancer wife, and they had this life. But once you add children to that mix, and I think this is a failing in Christianity and Buddhism, the idea that we will take out the best and most compassionate people and they won't become parents, and genetically they won't pass on the gifts they have. And I think that is going to cause a deterioration in society. I tend more towards the Jewish and Muslim view that the family is incredibly important, and that being a good parent is perhaps the most significant thing we can achieve. So choosing your authorities, going, does this person really know what they're talking about? And as I say, with Tim Spector, 900 papers, all sorts of studies, it's very good to check that out, because even in the mainstream, we're being sold a bill of goods every day. We're being told all sorts of things that are really fundamentally untrue. And, in the US, we're seeing the rise of Christian nationalism. We're seeing the rise of these groups of people who, for some reason, believe that they are different to people who have a different skin color. So we have at the extreme end of that, neo-Nazis who are perhaps of Polish or even Hungarian descent, who believe that they can be Aryans because they haven't, really studied the depth of the Hitler doctrine and, understood that they in fact are despised people just as much as the Jews are, because they've latched onto this one concept, which is white skin. That sense of, we're better than you are, we belong, we have the truth, you don't have the truth. And the truth comes from a guru, it comes from an authority figure who, when you look at them, Rajneesh fascinated me from the very first encounter, because when I looked at one of his books, I said, but I've seen these ideas before. Mm-hmm. These are stolen ideas. He liked Paul Rep's Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, but he didn't really remember the stories properly. So he'd tell the story, for example, about the swordsman, and who he apprentices to a master, and the master has him doing the cooking and the cleaning and the shopping, and just keeps hitting him with a stick all the time. And for 10 years, he keeps, awake or asleep, hitting him with a stick. And eventually he becomes the greatest sword master in Japan because nobody can touch him. He can dodge anything. And Rajneesh retells this story, having forgotten it's about a sword master. And so he says this guy was hitting him until he became enlightened and became a master. So he can't even be bothered with the details. When you come to that kind of second-hand material, and there's so much of it out there, and realize that these are people often like Rajneesh who are completely manipulative and cunning, and whose determination, they've realized that if you project this sense of serenity by taking 50 milligrams of diazepam or Valium a day. Maranand Sheela, his deputy, said he was taking 340 milligrams of diazepam. You can look pretty chilled out on that amount of a substance, but that's probably not a proper bliss state. It's probably not authentic. It's certainly not in any way useful to the rest of humanity to put on these airs and put forward this idea. So we groundlings struggling down here are some of us quite content with our lot. I know I am. And you seem to be too, Joe. And
well, at my age, I'd better be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it's important to say, I think, that we do not need these people, that they do not serve a useful function.
Well, no, they serve one useful function. And this is what my takeaway from my cult experience with Church Universal, the I Am movement, and related things like Agni Yoga, is that they tested me. And I managed to emerge, without too much damage. There was some, as opposed to some people that were in these groups for 10, 15 years and left, with their tail between their legs and having nothing much, and having a lot more recovery issue. So, and it spurred me on to study what I did, mostly to educate myself, because I was angry that I had known so little, that I was so naive, that I was drawn in, and that led to not only blessing myself by using comparative religious studies and psychological studies and studying magic and whatever I needed to do to get a better grasp on this whole thing, but that extended to other people. It became a social good. For like the same with you. You struggled to put together a picture and a piece of blue sky, and that book has been an enormous help to other people seeking a way to grasp what the hell Scientology is about. So I think that's where the good comes out of experiencing a cult, is in the recovery, but also in the lessons you can extend from that recovery to other people, just learning, in other words, sharing that experience. So but one is there converting negative experience to positive experience. So I've frequently said that the 9 years I spent in Scientology was a tremendous learning experience. I just wish it could have happened in 3 weeks instead of 9 years. But I'm a bit
bit of a slow learner, I suppose. So yes, that something dreadful has happened to you can then be translated into something very positive for yourself and for other people. And I must say, my experience of Scientology, as with you with Church Universal and Triumphant, was really quite light, really. You know, having seen what people went through, I was not humiliated, I was not abused. And that left me in the fortunate place that I could comment upon it. I could see it, I hope, more accurately than others. I'm sure more accurately, because I was looking at what Hubbard himself said and what Hubbard himself did, things that were palpable and provable.
John, did you ever think, and I've had this thought many times, that there would become a time in your life, or maybe in the past, where you never said the word Scientology again, or never said the word Hubbard again, and never said the word cult again? You know, have you ever had that feeling where it would be really nice to just shove it all to a prior chapter, shut that book, and just move on to something else?
I've had the experience, not just the feeling. In 1996, in January 1996, I wrote my last piece about Scientology, which was actually about how to recover, and put it up onto the internet, and that was me done. And I didn't read anything about Scientology between 1996 and 2011, when Janet Reitman published Inside Scientology. Well, I must have read something before that, because she contacted me before publishing the book. And but so I had a long experience of not talking about it, not thinking about it, because I knew that if I did engage, I couldn't be a spectator, I couldn't be a watcher. You know, when somebody made some fatuous statement about Hubbard, I would have to correct it and say, no, you know. So I mean, Janet Reitman, for example, going with the idea that the Church of Scientology was founded by Burton Farber in February 1954. And, you know, I would, if, you know, when that came about, I had to, no, it was founded by Ron Hubbard in Camden, New Jersey in December 1953. I've got the registration paper, which came from Camden. Hubbard himself claimed otherwise, because he didn't want to be caught, just in case this Church of Scientology thing didn't work. But so I would want to say something and become engaged. And I think it was very good for me to go away during that period. I didn't stop studying cults, or I became particularly interested in terrorism and gangs, to see the dynamics, to see, you know, Lifton's 8 Deadly Sins of Thought Reform. I studied more about the, you know, communist Chinese programs. Those things still fascinated me, but I wrote novels instead of talking to people wounded by Scientology. Then I came back, and I came back in 2013 because I realized that people were not necessarily recovering from their experience, that they were, tramlines that had been laid down were still there, and they were still moving along those tram lines.
But I bring this up because you know, someone once accused me, when I was an expert witness in a court case where I was being sued, a martial arts cult in Houston, Texas, and the opposing so-called expert, which we shredded on the witness stand, she wrote me an email and accused me of having, the reason I was going after cults and so forth, this is in the 1990 era, was because I had a reaction formation. Now, this is a psychological term. And so she kind of used this thought-stopping cliche to put me in a box. This is the reason I am who I am and why I do what I do, because I have this disease called a reaction formation. And so, and I thought about that, you know, and I wrote back to her, and we had some exchanges, of course, not agreeing. But it's partly true, you know, and I think we have to be careful not to have an overvalued reaction formation to something that we've experienced as bad, because then it becomes an obsession. We begin using thought terminating cliches ourselves to describe the cult, you know, and that can be a real danger in terms of internal discourse as well as social discourse. You know, it helps to look into the world of the so-called cult apologists, because some of them do quite valuable research in examining new religious movements or whatever, and they stick to their craft in trying to gather evidence, trying to make it factual, and then making an assessment. We might not agree with the assessment, but we can also benefit from the data that they've recovered from research, which is just data. And so it helps, I think, to have some humility in what we know about our own cult as well as other groups, and I've had ex-members of cults that I've criticized over the years come up to me and say, "Hey, Joe, that's not what we did in the group, and this is, and I go, okay, so I know I have to adjust my perception of and my facts, but yeah, it's an ongoing process. So I've got to wrap it up here, John. I've got to go check on my mom.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, that's my morning task, and so just to talk about her, talking about diet, you brought up. I mean, she's going to be 99. Has eaten basically her Hungarian diet all her life, which is a lot of carbohydrates and meats and gravies and all of this, and she's just amazing. She's just going on. My father, who lived to be 91, he never ate a meal before he poured salt all over it. Now it probably didn't do very good for him, but he lived to be 91. He worked full time in a factory till he was, as an electrician, till he was 90. Wow. So what the hell does salt have to do with it? I don't know. He was the salt of the earth, in the sense of his working habits. Yeah.
And I think what you say is, just to round up, is really true, that we have to approach the world with humility to the extent that we can. And we have to be willing, rather than taking a sort of polarized position, which seems to be what much of the world is doing at the moment, we need to embrace cognitive dissonance. We need to say, yes, please challenge me, please give me evidence if I'm wrong in any way, and that we need to be careful that we don't become gurus, that and it does happen occasionally. Somebody will come along and they, I in doing interventions, which I haven't done since the mid 90s, but one of the common questions, and I imagine this happened to you, when you're done with an intervention, is, what do you believe?
Oh yeah, all the time. And I immediately, my response has been for 30 years, because once I figured out that was a mistake, I say, well, you're asking the wrong question, and so it gets into a discussion about philosophy, and of course, good philosophy is about asking good questions, not about answers. And so developing the proper method to how to ask a question, how to run an experiment, how to, examine the foundation of a building before putting a building up, asking the proper questions will lead you to better answers, not the answer, but to better answers along the way. And so that's, and also to just sidestep this idea that I'm somehow a guru. Now that I'm a go-to person, I've tried to avoid that at all costs. One, I don't have time for it. No. I don't have time to be a guru. And, I even avoid the idea of being called an occult expert. Now, people tend to call me that because they like to be interviewing a occult expert. I use the word specialist, more often than not. And I think that kind of puts it in context. It's a specialty of mine, at times an obsession, but I have fun with it. I learn from it. And I think that studying influence on its many ranges, it goes into all aspects of human living. It's not just cult.
Yeah, and to change the world, to make a better world for humanity, we need to understand influence. We need to understand why it is that so many predatory people have power in this world. And
let me finish this one thing. 60 Minutes was looking at a study on social media and the other week, and they looked at TikTok, which originated in China. The way it's managed in China, TikTok, kids aren't allowed to use it for just anything like they do here. We have the opiated version of it. It's like an opium here, whereas there it guides children in science and in proper behavior and all of that, so that when you interview users of TikTok in China, what would be your favorite thing to do? They come up with stuff like astronaut, when you interview Western young people about TikTok, what comes up is they want to become a famous influencer.
Yes.
That's the difference. That's how opiate, it's like an opiated version of the, it's got the sugars and the salts and all that good stuff in it.
Trans fats.
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, I got to get going. Pleasure talking to you again, John.
As ever.
And not to diss Eckhart Tolle too much. I just think he got in over his head. I think he became handled. I don't, and hopefully he continues to be a happy man.
Yes, and hopefully all of those around him will also achieve happiness.
There you go. All right, John. Take care of yourself.
You too, my friend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.